and I really miss those times. So stay safe, wear a mask, socially distance, and hopefully we'll be back together as soon as possible. That would be much, much better. I want to start with some acknowledgements and then a little bit about the difference between a Zoom webinar and a Zoom meeting. I want to give extra special thanks to 3 people who without whom we wouldn't be providing this webinar. John Beeston, whose technical expertise is unbelievable, and he's in the background helping us right now, along with Linda Kussner, who has equally as amazing technical strength and is partially the reason that we can live stream this event. And Debbie Moberly, who is just an incredible organizer and has us all just point on where we need to be. The last thing I would like to do is thank Linda Cook for this amazing location that I'm in. It is in the Nehalem Bay area, but thanks to Linda Cook's photography, I can be there all the time, which is really wonderful. Before we begin, I would like to take a few minutes to talk to you about a Zoom webinar. If you've done Zoom meetings, you probably already are aware of some of the differences between a webinar and a Zoom meeting. You don't have to worry about a video or about a microphone. That is not on the webinar, but we do want to be able to interact with you. So the way we will interact with you is we will interact with you through a function called Q&A, or question and answers. The Q&A function, it will be exclusively used today. And in order to find it, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A come up. And that's the Q&A is the function that we'd like you to ask your questions. What we will do in the background is we will consolidate those questions and provide those to the panelists during Q&A session. So it's important that as you think of a question, you provide that question on Q&A. That way our team behind the scenes will have time to analyze, coordinate, and combine any and all of the questions. So hopefully we'll be able to answer as many questions as possible. If you're watching us on YouTube, we are also monitoring the chat function, and the chat function again is at the bottom of your screen, and we will use those questions as well. At the end of the last presentation, we'll have the 4 experts on the screen, and you'll be able to ask all 4 of the experts a question, or a question that you think all of them should be able to reply to. So in today's meeting, the first thing we'll do is we'll do a brief overview of the activities of the Emergency Volunteer Corps during this crisis, followed by 3 panelists. The 3 panelists will focus on the response to these crises by both the county and the state. And then we'll be able to update you on some changes in the evacuation area and evacuation plan, updated maps that we'll bring forth today. So during this time of COVID and fires, EVC has been hard at work supporting the community in clear and concise information regarding information that you need at this time. Our biggest learning has been that preparation for a tsunami and earthquake is not so dissimilar from preparing for any emergency. There's a lot of consistency. First of all, the go bags are things that you need and will always need, but I'm particularly proud of our WASH team and the WASH training that we've done. We focus on how best to wash your hands in a way that is thorough and will be effective in this COVID crisis. And if you remember about our sanitation, we strongly recommended that you had plenty of toilet paper in the background, which at the beginning of COVID, I think was a very effective strategy to have, as you might remember. So for the COVID emergency, initially we brought together a regional team of experts that got you accurate information in a very timely manner. Our Prepare Your Neighborhood teams provided needed supplies to our merchants to help them prevent the spread of the disease. And they provided those resources such as hand wipes and sanitation wipes, which helped the merchants continue to do business at a point where it was becoming even more difficult. We coordinated mass distribution for our community and for our visitors. And through our neighborhood structure, we provided support to individuals who were unable to leave their home. During our recent fires, we helped people plan and prepare for an evacuation of a very different kind. And also we talked about the evacuation and emergency warning system that was unique to fires. And we made sure that our community understood that. As you know, go bags are critical and standard, and having a go bag in the event of an evacuation is always an important commodity to have. But an evacuation in a fire is very different from an evacuation in a tsunami or an earthquake. Certainly you don't want to go to your assembly sites. What you want to do is get out of, when an evacuation announcement at level 3 comes, you want to get out of the area as soon as possible. The reality is that upon returning, you may or may not have a home when you return. And so the important thing is to think through ahead of time, what are the valuable things that you want to take with you that are irreplaceable? And now is the time to think about that. It's the time to think about that is not right before the event. In a recent email we sent to you, actually announcing this particular meeting, as part of that email, we provided a list of supplies that was generated by 2 amazing community members. Mike and Linda Cook took that on as a task and felt that it was really important for themselves to put together that list. And then they shared it with the community, which I just thought was amazing. That, along with a few edits by Debbie Moberly, is what you see in that email. And I strongly recommend that you review it and think about it in terms of a potential fire. We continue to provide the go bag supplies, and we continue to have our pop-up go bag store. Our next go bag pop-up store is on October the 10th. In this COVID environment, it needs to be by registration only. So we hope you will go to our website, which is EVCNB, and register for, if you choose to do that, register for attending the go bag store. We have a ready-made go bag, which I think is exceptional and is put together by our team. We also have supplies at cost that we can provide to you based on your particular need. And as always, we have been working to communicate with our community to make sure that we can help people respond, and we're there to support our community. We've actually been quite busy during this period of time and going, as you might imagine, to a lot of Zoom meetings as well. So let's get to our presenters. Our very first presenter is Tillamook County's amazing emergency manager. Name a disaster, and odds are Gordon has experienced it and survived it. Gordon has been an incredible help to our community and has partnered with us to help get us the stuff we need to be prepared. With no further delay, I give you Gordon McCraw.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Yeah, I've unfortunately been in places that seem to have disasters and gave me a little bit of experience. So we'll talk about how it actually works at a disaster 911 center, incident command. You frequently hear us talk about the incident command being activated, and exactly what does that mean? Well, back in 2006, I got here. That was a year after Katrina, which is what that and the fact she told me that she was moving back to Oregon and I was welcome to come along. So I decided to come out here, and here we are. In 2007, then Sheriff Anderson put me in, or asked me to go over and participate in something that had just started. Previous to that, the fire department would, in a disaster, work from their location, and the police department or sheriff's office would be at their offices, and everybody was spread out all over the county. With the incident command team, we put the decision makers all in the same room next to each other. So the fire department will use the recent Pike fire as an example. The fire department was there. Then we had a representative from the hospital, representative from the police department in Tillamook, because they were giving us a hand. The sheriff's office, myself, we even had Adventist Health there, and we had a representative there from the public utilities. So the electrical people were working phenomenally, both telling where the down lines were and deactivating and energizing lines so that the firefighters were safe, but only those people that needed to be out of power were out of power. So something would come in, and like I said, the fire itself, the fire department representative in the incident command was dispatching their resources directly from his location. Same with the police department and the sheriff's office. Whenever the ODF would put out a evacuation level 3, which means you have to leave, the sheriff's office had people going out knocking door to door to make sure they got the word and that they had to leave. It works really well by doing it that way. We're all part of the incident command team system, which is originally born from FEMA. They like to have everybody operating off the same sheet of music, and that allows us to do it. It actually works very well because you can increase it to the size that you need, and then once things start going down, they decrease it in size. So that's how the incident command team works. Again, if it's a minor flood event that I need to monitor, then it's just me, or maybe me and somebody else. In this situation, I don't know, we had hundreds when you include all the firefighters, because there was ODF up there. There was the South Fork prison camp has teams of firefighters, and they sent the team down, and I can't give enough praise to the fire departments who were able to limit the damage to one detached garage is all that we suffered in a 301 acre fire that was pretty interesting and quite busy for the first 3 days. So let's talk about how it would work with the tsunami. Obviously, it would only work if we had a distant tsunami event. And I say only work because if we had the local event, we're going to be part of the disaster just like everyone else. The severe ground shaking followed by the tsunami, and then we all become victims. So you may recall that years ago, me, the public works director, and the guy from Corps Engineers got together and come up with this idea that we would sister or adopt, I guess we'll say, or be adopted, another county outside the disaster area, which in this case, we picked Umatilla County. They sent over their public works director and their emergency manager to learn the lay of the land and the names of the people. And we figured that would be where this plan would be enacted, is if we had the local event, then we'd need them to come over and be in our place, because again, we would be victims just like everyone else. But you may recall a couple of years ago, Umatilla had a big flood. So the director called me up and said, "Hey, I'm an expert at fires. You're an expert in flooding. How about you come over?" And I did, and helped him with that. And he offered help on this fire. So it all worked out to our advantage. Again, you know, a local event would be Umatilla. A distant tsunami event, then yes, we would activate the incident command just as we did in 2011. And then we also got the search and rescue people to help us by going door to door and knocking on any of the homes that were in at the time, evacuation area. It was later that we were fortunate enough to get those LiDAR maps that DOGAMI put out that told us we kind of overreacted, but it told us even by overreacting, that we were able to do the things that we needed to do on a distant tsunami within the 4-hour period, to make sure that everything is safe. Somebody had asked about COVID, because yeah, I'm dealing with the COVID incident also. COVID right now, we have 47 positive, 6 presumptive. Nobody is in the hospital, and the monitoring 3. So back to the fire though, yes, we had volunteers. By volunteers, I mean the loggers sent up and operated heavy equipment to help build the fire line around the fire. And it worked out tremendously good. Like I said, we were very fortunate. We burned 301 acres, and we only lost a garage, and the garage was on a vacant property at the top of a hill. The gentleman I was talking to had bought, I forget, 12, 14 acres, something like that. And he'd brought up a lot of equipment, lawnmowers, ride mowers, and things like that to maintain the property. And after a while of adding equipment, he decided to add a garage up there to store it all in. And that is actually the only thing that we lost in it. So I consider that very good. And I wasn't monitoring my time, so I don't really know how much more I got or less I got, but that is really the gist of it. And I can sit back and wait for any questions when and if somebody has it, and I'll turn it back over to Linda.
Okay, well, actually, you're going to turn it over to me, Gordon.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we do have a couple of questions. First, you mentioned COVID. So if you could just tell us, what was your biggest challenge during the has been your biggest challenge during the COVID period?
Well, the biggest challenge initially was how fast things were changing. We would get guidance on 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday, and by 4 o'clock in the evening, it had changed again. And then the other thing we ran into a lot was the governor liked to issue, after a while, she would issue her guidance late in the evening on Friday, which meant that all weekend we were responding to questions about guidance that we didn't write. So that sometimes got to be a little concerning on our part. It's just been trying to keep up with the changes. And I encourage, of course, everybody, because we do get a lot, hey, I thought this is how we had to do things. And the answer is yes, it is how we did things last month, but this month is different. So go to the Oregon Health Authority as your best source, because everything on their site is up to date, and use that as your information center.
Thank you, Gordon. So one last question. When power is down during fires and earthquake, is there a way to tell if the lines are alive?
You have to assume they are. During Katrina, we knew the lines were down. There was no power anywhere in South Louisiana. Basically anything south of Baton Rouge was without power. And to the east, almost to Florida, was without power. So we didn't have any problems running around chopping the lines to get them out of the road. But in this case, the best thing to do is just assume the line is active, because if you're wrong, the outcome's not going to be good.
Thank you. And this is the very last question. So who is on your team for the Incident Command Center?
It's more of positions than people. It's come to the point where I'm almost always the incident commander. But the Tillamook Fire puts a person there to manage their resources. Adventist Health has somebody there to manage their resources. The Tillamook Police Department, who, as you know, normally is dealing with the flood event in the North Main area, they have a representative there. The Sheriff's Office has a representative. And again, each representative, when we have that incident, especially like with the fire, you can imagine that the 911 operators are doing everything they can just to keep up with the phone calls. Kudos to them. At the peak of the thing, they were getting calls at a rate of 120 an hour. That doesn't sound like much in your book, but I can tell you that's 2 every minute, and you can anticipate that several of those calls takes more than a minute. So they had everybody, all hands on deck, and they were answering calls like crazy. And again, with the incident command team activated, they don't have to worry about dispatching the resources because the resource manager is doing that for them, sending the equipment to the area that it needs to go to, whether it's police, fire, ambulance, whatever it is.
Okay, thank you.
Public Works was, I'll just mention, Public Works is there. In this case, PUD was there. We had anybody and everybody that had to deal with this. A representative was there helping us dispatch those resources.
Great, thank you. And we do have a couple more questions that we'll try to feed in at the Q&A at the end of the session. So I'm going to turn it back to Linda Kozlowski.
And Gordon, I think one of the important things to know about Tillamook County is that we work really well together. And under your leadership and bringing all of the technical people together, it really has made a difference in terms of responding to all kinds of emergencies.
I will only say that every talk I give, I always tell people I'm the most blessed emergency manager anywhere in the United States, because when the people come in the door, they leave their hats and their ego at the door, and we just get the job done.
Yeah, it's amazing. So thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much. So our next speaker that we're really excited about is Dr. Althea Rizzo. Dr. Rizzo joined the Oregon Emergency Management in 2008 as a Geologic Hazard Program Coordinator. She has been a frequent speaker here and has successfully helped implement outreach programs for seismic hazards, such as earthquakes and tsunamis, as well as other natural hazards. We've been blessed to have her here, and she's just been incredible in providing data and information and just down-to-earth practical responses. Recently, she has been helping at a state level in the coordination of our current fire response. She will be speaking today about the state's role in response for all hazards, included but not limited to tsunami and fires. Welcome, Althea. It's nice to have you back.
Hey, it's nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this opportunity. So I wanted to kind of set the stage of where we are with Cascadia, because some folks may be new to the area and don't have the educational background on what the fuss is about for Cascadia. And this really is our existential hazard here in the Pacific Northwest. We do get floods, we do get fires, we do have landslides. So we have these events, they tend to be fairly localized to an area. This latest fire incident was extremely unusual because we do have these large fires, but they're usually limited in number at the same time. We just were unfortunate enough to have that windstorm that caused these multiple large fires all at the same time. And quite honestly, it was a good run up for what we can expect to see when we do have Cascadia. We did have some advantages in that most of us didn't lose power. Most of us, were able to stay in our homes, with the exception of the folks that were under evacuation. But when we're looking at Cascadia subduction zone, this will really impact the entire Pacific Northwest. And in all honesty, it's going to impact the whole nation when this happens, because it will be basically an all hands on deck event for responding to this, because the Cascadia subduction zone runs from Northern California all the way up to British Columbia. And so if we do get the full 9.0 earthquake, the shaking is going to start, at one end and work its way to the other. And that shaking could last 2 to 4 minutes. The size of the earthquake could be up to a 9.0. And we look at Cascadia, it's really similar in size and impact to the 2004 Sumatra and the 2011 Japanese earthquake. So you kind of think about what was happening there. We expect to see here on the Oregon coast, but not just Oregon. This will impact Northern California. It will impact Washington. It'll impact British Columbia directly from the earthquake. But that tsunami, just like in 2011, when we got the tsunami from Japan, that tsunami will cross the ocean. It'll impact Hawaii, Alaska, possibly Japan and other nation around the Pacific. So we know that they do produce devastating tsunamis after the earthquake. Oops. Somehow I dropped it off there. My apologies, somehow there we go. So what can we expect to see in Cascadia? Well, first of all, it's going to be strong ground shaking. And if we do get the full RIP 9, that shaking can last anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes, depending where you are. It could last longer, depending on what kind of ground you're sitting on, where you are situated in relation to that. So this is really the big hazard. And this is where, you know, we're going to see a lot of the damage and how we manage to mitigate our built environment leading up to this. On the bottom of this slide, you can see it's sort of a tale of two different earthquakes. We have the Haiti earthquake, which was a 7.0 on the left, and the Tohoku earthquake, the Japanese earthquake on the right, which was a 9.0 earthquake. And the difference here is that Japan has spent pretty much the last 30 to 50 years building its infrastructure, seismically retrofitting needing buildings, and just making sure that when these large earthquakes happen, that they're prepared. The next other hazard that we need to think about is landslides, because when we have shaking, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of landslides. And this is going to really impact the ability of the coast to get supplies in. Some of those routes between I-5 and 101 are expected to be down for 3 to 5 years after Cascadia. And so when we tell people that you need to be 2 weeks ready, we're really acknowledging over on the coast that you really need to be 4 weeks ready, because it could be some time before we are able to get supplies into you. Another one of the hazards that we deal with in an earthquake is liquefaction. And this is where you have unconsolidated soils that basically turn to pudding or sand eruptions, or like in the bottom of the slide here in Alaska, cause lateral spreading and cause damage that way. Another one of the hazards, of course, is the tsunami. And in Oregon, it's really, really, really important to understand that we get two types of tsunamis here in Oregon. First is the local tsunami caused by the Cascadia subduction zone, and that's the big bad one. But we also get distant tsunamis. Now, distant tsunamis are much more polite than local tsunamis, because we will get a warning they are coming. The closest source for a distant tsunami is the Alaskan Aleutian chain, and that's also our worst case scenario. That's about 3.5 to 4 hours away. So we would get that much time to evacuate from just the bays and harbors, because remember, we're not dealing with the earthquake, we're just dealing with this distant tsunami. So when it comes to a local tsunami, there won't be a warning sent out. Basically, the earthquake is your warning. You feel the earthquake, you get to high ground immediately, and you exercise your emergency evacuation plans that you've so wisely practiced at least once a year. And then, of course, you have aftershocks. And some of these aftershocks are going to be large enough to cause another tsunami. And after the Japanese event, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of aftershocks. So, you know, what does this mean for Oregon, and what are the implications for Oregon if Cascadia happened today? Well, luckily it won't be a complete breakdown of society, even though I totally rock that outfit. We know that Oregon is at risk from an earthquake and tsunami that can significantly impact our people and economy for decades. But we've been planning for this. We've been mitigating for this. So when it happens, we will not be ready, but we will be more ready tomorrow than we are today. So this is really a process that we're working towards. There's no such thing as perfect preparedness. We are simply working to be better prepared tomorrow than we are today. So when we're looking at the role of Oregon Office of Emergency Management in this, the first thing to remember is we are basically a coordination agency. We do not have huge stockpiles of stuff waiting around to ship out. And when it comes to these types of emergencies, it's basically, it starts at the local, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, and then it sort of moves up the chain. Gordon alluded to that in his talk. But as you can see, it all starts with the governor and it works down. The Oregon Office of Emergency Management is a part of the Oregon Military Department. So the Adjutant General oversees our director at OEM, and then it sort of flows down through the different structures here at OEM for how we respond to an event like a wildfire or a flood or any of the other natural hazards that we're dealing with. So when we're looking at the OEM structure, we have the director's office, and they really direct policy direction, the strategic direction. They are the legislative liaison. They go talk to legislators. They provide testimony about bills. They also manage the public information. So working on shakeout or, any of the other, like September Preparedness Month, or if we do May as Volcano Awareness Month, our public information group basically manages that outreach to the public. And then we have a private sector program, and this is where we interface with larger entities in order to get aid to, or in order to educate the private sector on how to prepare for these large emergencies. This has been really invaluable in this last wildfire in getting resources out to communities. So underneath the director's office, we have two different sections. We have operations and preparedness, and this is the group that runs the Emergency Coordination Center. And basically what the Emergency Coordination Center, or the ECC, does is we bring in our state agency partners. That could be ODOT, the DAS, the Department of Administrative Services. They're basically where we go to get our stuff. They're the ones that purchase the stuff and help get the stuff out to where it needs to be. And so all of those partners sit in the room, at least we all sat together pre-COVID. Now it's a little bit more complicated because we have to be far more spread out. And so when a request comes in, we reach out to these partners, the Emergency Support Function, or ESF. We have several different assessment tools, and the one that you may be familiar with, there's a public version that you can Google Raptor, Oregon Raptor, and sign on, and that is where we have our situational awareness, the mapping of where the fires are, where the evacuation lines are, those kinds of things. And then another piece of this section is the planning, training, and exercise. So the plans work with developing plans for around different hazards, different things, and then we train and have exercises going forward. And this is where my program dwells, here in operations and preparedness. So my role as a geologic hazards coordinator, I oversee the earthquake, the tsunami, and the volcano programs here at OEM, and that could be anything from talking to groups like you to working on the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program with John Allen from DOGAMI, or it could be developing a Be 2 Weeks Ready program that will be launched in a year to help the public become 2 weeks ready. So I have a lot of different things to do. I never ever get bored. So another one of the sections that we have here at OEM is the mitigation and recovery section. So in the life cycle of a disaster, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but you basically have the bad thing happens, and then operations and preparedness section works the ECC to manage the response to that event. But eventually the event is out of the response phase. You know, the fires are starting to go out. We lift the evacuation areas, and it goes over to recovery section. And this is where we have a lot of the long-term activities going on. You have damage assessment, you're managing mass care, the evacuation centers. Right now, they're working on trying to get people out of congregate shelters, the Red Cross shelters that we kind of think is the classical evacuation center, out into non-congregate types of sheltering, which could take, you know, many different forms. And so their main role is the finance and the mitigation. They manage several very large mitigation grants from FEMA so that communities like yours can mitigate some of the hazards that you have. So when we're looking at, you know, the life cycle of a disaster, you have the bad thing happen, you have the disaster occur. And then what happens is people like Gordon, they respond to it. And then if Gordon or the city or the county become overwhelmed, they can reach first, you know, to their neighboring cities or counties. And if their mutual aid compacts and agreements can't fulfill that need, then they can reach up to the state. So the disaster occurs, the locals respond, and then what the mayor or county executive can do is declare emergency. And once you declare an emergency, that gives you access to certain resources. And the type of declaration that you get can really influence the kind of resources that you can access, either the state or federal level. So once the county declares that emergency, they can start to request aid from OEM and from the state partnerships. And then the state will activate the Emergency Coordination Center. Now, this time, probably about the same time that Gordon was standing up his EOC, we were standing up the ECC. So a lot of this stuff, while it may look sequential, it's really happening all at the same time. And boy, did it all happen at the same time this time. And then what happens is the governor will declare a state of emergency, and then you can have state resources deployed. And so once the disaster gets to a certain size or level, then our mitigation recovery does what they call an initial damage assessment. What they're trying to do is find out how much stuff was broken. Was it public infrastructure? Was it residences? You know, how much stuff and what is the value of that stuff? Because different types of declarations have different thresholds for how much stuff is broken. And so if you get enough stuff broken, you can start to request federal assistance. And for the wildfires, enough was damaged that we were eligible to request what they call individual assistance. So when you're looking at the kind of assistance that FEMA can provide, you have public assistance, and that's not, you know, families and stuff. That is cities, counties, so that for infrastructure and the larger community-based infrastructure. Individual assistance is where you start to see where there's more support for individuals and families that are affected after this. So one thing to remember is that it really starts with preparedness. And this is where I've been so impressed with this group. And I've told Linda many times that I want to clone her and put her in every single county I have here in Oregon. Because what we saw in COVID, I mean, I think we've all learned a lot from COVID. First of all, you never have enough toilet paper, no matter how much toilet paper you have. It's never, ever enough. But that we know that perfect preparedness doesn't exist. But what we really need to think about is being more prepared tomorrow than we are today. And I wanted to invite folks to join the 2 Weeks Ready Facebook group that we have available. So I have the link down here, and I'll have someone post the link when they post this out. But this is my contact information, and I am happy to chat at any given time. Trust me, any given time to talk about Cascadia. So I am now ready for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see what we kind of have for questions. Debbie, I can't hear you.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So with the recent, fire damage and the subsequent rains, are we more prone to slides, particularly if there were an earthquake?
Yeah. So after a wildland fire, especially up into the mountainous areas, if we do get a heavy rain after a fire, we can see a lot of mud flows and debris flows, even without an earthquake. But yes, if we get rain, we do tend to get more landslides. It doesn't take much of an earthquake to cause them. I mean, and we get a heavy rain in February, someone in Portland sneezes, and we have landslides in the West Hills. So the wetter it is, the more likely there are going to be landslides.
Thank you. Also, I'm not quite clear when, in terms of, as an individual, can I contact the state and ask for help in an emergency?
No, the best bet is to reach out locally, because what you need, probably other people are needing. So that gives Gordon an opportunity to coordinate his response. Because as an individual, there's during the disaster, during the active disaster, there really isn't a lot that we can do for you as an individual. But you can reach out to your local county and city for help.
Thank you. And what are the current plans in OEM to develop robust communication systems such as ham network, capable of contacting remote areas like the coast during a major Cascadia event?
So that's a really good question, because we know that communication is going to be very difficult after this event, because one, we won't have power, two, cell phone towers will be down, lines will be cut. So yes, the state is developing a very robust communication response plan. And we saw in this last wildfire some of that activity that we're going to expect to see after Cascadia. This is kind of a good look at what we need to do. And so developing ham radios, I recommend that just like everyone should be getting first aid, everyone should be getting a ham radio license so that they can be a part of that communication solution after an event like Cascadia. But, that's one piece of it. They have the capability of bringing in basically these trailers that can function as cell towers. They'll bring in a generator to run those cell towers so that if you can charge your phone, you will be able to at least send texts. And that's what we recommend is after a disaster like that, oftentimes our phone systems can be overwhelmed. So we recommend that people use text messaging to send messages to each other.
I just want to take a moment to remind our viewers to use the question and answer box to get your questions submitted. We do see someone with their hand raised and we're not able to respond to that. So please enter your question into the Q&A box. So then the next question for you, Althea, is, I believe you covered this in your presentation, but if you could also just remind us of how long it will take for a response to arrive on the coast in the event of a Cascadia event.
Well, I'll be honest with you. It will likely be at least a week to 2 weeks before we can get anything out here, because like I said before, we don't have stockpiles of stuff that we can ship out here. So that would mean it would take time for the feds to bring that material in, and then it would take time to get it out to you over on the coast. Now there is the other option that, and I know that in Tillamook, in Clatsop County, in Lincoln County, they've been working with the Navy to find landing areas where the Navy could bring in resources. But again, it's going to be for the Navy to get here at least 2 weeks. Because remember, this is going to be impacting the entire West Coast. And resources that we would normally be able to call on for help, they're going to be impacted too. And that's one thing that I really would like to emphasize to everyone. Your normal responders, the firemen, the police, the doctors, the nurses, the EMTs, they're all going to be victims of Cascadia too. So we are really our own first responders, and that's why I recommend that people take it first aid and advanced first aid, so that when Cascadia does happen, much like in any other disaster, you know, the majority of response comes from your neighbors, co-workers, and your family.
Thank you, Althea. I think we're going to leave it there for now, and I'm going to turn it back to Linda to introduce our next speaker.
All right, excellent. First of all, I'd really like to thank Althea. That was excellent, Althea. And just a couple of adds to that. You had talked about the need in terms of communication and ham radio, and we strongly support that and recommend that as well. In our community, we have something we call yellow radio, which allows people to communicate at a level not as technical as ham radio. And so if there's anyone out there that is interested in a communication strategy, please go to info@evcnb.org and we'll provide that information to you. The other area that we're working on is solar charging, because we're very concerned in an emergency that we'll lose that. And our belief here locally is it could be as much as a month before you get to an isolated area like ours. So planning for a long time, supporting yourself is absolutely the right message. And we really appreciate your sending that to us. Thank you, Althea. So I'm going to now introduce Dr. Jonathan Allen. Dr. Allen is a coastal geomorphologist and one of our favorite speakers. After completing his undergraduate and postgraduate degree in New Zealand, specializing in coastal processes and hazard, he joined DOGAMI, Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries in 2001. In 2015, John took over the Tsunami program from George Priest, a kind of an old friend of our area and somebody that really initiated a lot of the information that we now use. His recent focus has been on updating the tsunami inundation modeling for Oregon, providing much more improved understanding of how long it takes to evacuate and what you need to do in each of our coastal communities. John has a wonderful ability of taking very complex concepts and communicating them in a way we can all understand. He has joined us on the screen, and take it away, John.
All right, thank you very much, Linda. And once again, thank you all for inviting me along today to share some new information with you all about the Cascadia subduction zone, and obviously the tsunami inundation maps that we have been working on for the Oregon coast over the last several years. So the purpose of today's presentation is to really share with you some updates, particularly with respect to new inundation maps. And let me just remind you again why we're all here. So these two screens, two images are actually from obviously the 2011 Japanese earthquake and accompanying tsunami. And just to remind us of what we can expect to see here on the Oregon coast. And obviously the image on the left there shows the magnitude of the tsunami wave as it's inundating the Sendai Plain and about to inundate the local airport, which is just to the right of that image. On the right-hand side is obviously the aftermath of that event and the virtual complete destruction of communities and the associated distribution of debris and the accompanying casualties that are going to come from this type of event. Now, this event was only 9 years ago, so not very long ago at all. But it's already time has already gone by, and this starts to sort of fade into our memories. And this is one of the challenges before all of us as we try to both educate and remind of the magnitude of this event. And why we need to be prepared. And as Althea and both Gordon and Althea have indicated, the requirement is that you need to be prepared for up to 2 weeks because the state will not be there to help you in the initial days following the event. And so it really behooves us all to start that process. And obviously with COVID and with the recent fires that we've experienced, it's all a reminder about the need to be prepared at the individual level and family level. So what I'm showing here is obviously the goal of the presentation. The first up to provide you with just another overview of the Cascadia events, the supporting data and what's been done before. To talk a little bit about some updates to the evacuation modeling, specifically the evacuation maps or beat the wave maps as we call them. And then importantly, to introduce you to some new inundation modeling that we've completed for all of Tillamook County, give you some sense of why we're doing this, the results, and obviously the next steps. And then finally, to touch on some new information that'll be coming down the pipeline in terms of county-wide assessments of the damage associated with a Cascadia tsunami for different scenarios, the anticipated debris, and obviously the potential or numbers of casualty and displaced population. So I want to draw your attention to, first off, to Japan, which, as Althea indicated, has had a very long history of preparing for these great earthquakes and accompanying tsunami. And this is an example of a tsunami stone established on the Sendai Plain, and it basically is describing the effects of the 8869 Jogan tsunami. And what it says on that rock is that the large earthquake was accompanied by a luminous phenomenon, and coastal areas were illuminated in the dark. Sometime after severe seismic shocks, a gigantic tsunami reached the coast and invaded entire Sendai Plain. Rising seawater flooded an old castle town, Tagajo, causing the loss of 1,000 lives. And this was an account that was published in Minoura et al. In 2001. Similarly, the Japanese have actually been recording the events of distant type tsunamis that have taken place around the Pacific Rim. And obviously the most recent and famous example of one of these distant events is actually the 1700 tsunami that occurred along the Pacific Northwest coast or US West Coast on January 26 at 9 p.m. And this event is actually recorded in harbors and ports on the Japanese coast. And as a direct measure, a direct account of that event having traveled across the Pacific Ocean, inundating those ports and harbors on the Japanese coastline and causing damage in those communities. So that's one of the records that we have available to us of past Cascadia events. We also have history that has been passed down from our Native American tribes who have been living along the mouths of many of our estuaries, who have actually recorded the events of such as the 1700 event, and have been able to pass that down through by word of mouth to their tribes and people. And so these types of references indicate the effects of great flooding, great ground shaking, and also actually include accounts of what to do in those events, which is to get to high ground. And the example that I'm showing here is actually of a historical marker that's been established at Taft in Lincoln City at the mouth of Siletz Bay there, and that was just recently updated earlier this year. So besides the historical evidence that comes from, or qualitative evidence that comes from word of mouth and from written records, we don't have any record like that on the Oregon coast, other than from geologic evidence that is provided to us from studying cores that have been taken both along our coastline and estuaries, in some of our small lakes, and of course out in the ocean along the continental shelf there, which is defined by that red line showing the plate boundary where the Juan de Fuca plate is actually being subducted down below the North American plate to the right of that red line. So there's extensive evidence that's derived from all these different cores of what we call coseismic subsidence, which is the vertical lowering of the coastline as recorded in cores and in tidal marshes that define, how much the coastline basically was dropped at the time of that event. I mentioned also there are deposits in small lakes, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, at one particular site down on Bandon on the southern Oregon coast. And of course, I mentioned records that have been defined by Chris Goldfinger and researchers at Oregon State, looking at the effects of what we call turbidite deposits that are formed essentially off the edge of the continental shelf at the base of the bottom of the trench there, recording the events of large submarine landslides that were triggered by these great earthquakes over time. And based on the combined information of all these different data sets, provides us with a very long record of 10,000 years of past tsunami events. And it turns out that this record is in fact one of the longest in the world. So I just wanted to show a schematic just to remind us of what we're preparing for. So this is a three-dimensional view, a slice looking from south to north into the subduction zone. And on the left there, you see the Juan de Fuca plate that is diving below the North American plate. That zone in which the fault line where it's currently locked, marked by that red line, is about 30 to 60 miles due west of us. And there's a region right along our coastline where that interface is now locked and strain is building. And that's defined by that area that's been termed stuck zone. And so we know this because of the fact that there is little to no earthquake activity along the Oregon coast or the state of Oregon. We see some activity in northern Washington, some activity in California and northern California, but nothing happening along the Oregon coast. And that is a testament to the fact that strain is building up along this coastline. And we know that that strain is building because the Juan de Fuca is arriving along our coastline at that interface there at a rate of about 30 to 40 millimeters per year. And so it's continuing to build that pressure over time. So we have evidence from a variety of coastal lakes. This is one from Bradley Lake on the southern Oregon coast near Bandon. And each of those yellow layers defines a tsunami event. And what we look for in these deposits is evidence of fining upwards in those sand layers, as well as fining landward towards the most landward extent of that lake. We know that these are tsunami deposits because this area is sufficiently far enough inland, away from coastal processes and storm waves, such that those processes aren't able to transport sediments into these lakes. And so we know based on that, these deposits are almost certainly derived from these great earthquakes and tsunamis that overflow the dune and eventually make their way some 300 feet or so landward of the coastline into the lake itself. So the second image you see there is an example of what that core looks like, and the tsunami sand that's been trapped on top of an eroded contact, which is made up of broken up bits of mud. Sometimes it actually may bury soils. And then above that, we have additional sediments that have started to accumulate after the tsunami over time. We also have, as I mentioned, evidence from these offshore turbidites that provide us with clues as to the frequency and occurrence of different large events. And it turns out, based on the combined information from all these different data sets, that there have been something like 43 tsunami events in total along the Oregon-Washington coast, going back roughly 10,200 years. And of these 43 events, 19 are associated with what we call a full margin rupture, where the entire subduction zone, and if you look at that left-hand side there, the area defined by the red A, ruptures and basically unzips, triggering one of these great subduction events and accompanying tsunamis. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the last example of this event having taken place was actually 320 years ago today, associated with the great earthquake of 1700. We also know that there have been a bunch of smaller events having taken place, mostly on the southern Oregon coast, and these make up roughly 19 smaller events that occur on a much more frequent basis. And it turns out that these smaller events tend to rupture roughly every 240 years or so, give or take some amount. So we know that these smaller events are much, much more frequent relative to the full margin event. And estimates put it at somewhere around 16 to 22% for a full margin. That is an entire Cascadia subduction zone unraveling versus a more frequent smaller event at around 40% chance in any given year. So all of this information is really the foundation for the modeling that ensued between 2010 and 2013. Using that information, we were able to define 5 different scenarios, of which 5 different scenarios of these great earthquakes, these full margin events. And these were defined based on a t-shirt size from small, medium, large to extra, extra large, being the penultimate, what we call the maximum considered event. And then there's a bunch of smaller events that have taken place that occur much more frequently. Here's a picture of our modeling team that was part of the original modeling team. And many of these folks, Laura Gable, used to be Laura Steinley, is on this call as well, and she'll be part of the panel later today. But many of these other folks are actually still involved to some degree in terms of the work that's ongoing today. For example, Joseph Zhang is our tsunami modeler and is responsible for some of the latest modeling work that we've done along our coastline, and particularly in Tillamook County. And of course, with great input from Rob Witters now with the US Geological Survey, Chris Goldfinger, who's at Oregon State, and George Priest, who's now retired, but still is actively involved in research on Cascadia. So as a result of all this work, a lot of information has been generated. These include maps such as these tsunami evacuation maps, like the example I'm providing here for the Nehalem Valley. And then the middle map there shows where all these tsunami evacuation maps have been generated for communities along our Oregon coast. And then on the right is what we call our tsunami inundation maps, which actually show the complete suite of inundation scenarios for different communities up and down the coast. Now you can actually get access to all this information now via the online tsunami evacuation portal that's hosted on Nanus, as well as through a smartphone application where you can download that application, and it'll allow you to locate yourself anywhere in the inundation zone up and down the Oregon coast. And I encourage you all to have that map as you travel, as part of your planning, pre-disaster planning whenever you travel and move to different communities along our coast, so you know where the nearest evacuation zone is to your location. So I'm going to touch on now some recent work that Laura Gable in particular has been involved in, and I briefed you all about this back in March. That work has been now published, and I'll show you where you can find that information. But just a reminder, the purpose behind these pedestrian evacuation maps that we were generating. And the penultimate goal there is to determine how much time we all have in order to get from point A to point B. In other words, to get from somewhere down on the beach to an area outside of the inundation zone, outside of that tsunami zone. And the example I'm showing you here is, of course, Seaside, Oregon. And you can just make out in that image there, a lot of people out on the beach there as part of a volleyball tournament. And this is one of the big concerns, because obviously many of these people are probably not very familiar with the area, are not familiar with evacuation maps, and certainly probably don't know where to go. And so the challenge before all of us is how we educate people through signage, through maps, in order to advise them where the best place is to go in order to get outside of that inundation zone. This map also highlights that some routes will probably fail. And these are indicated by those bridge failure symbols, while other sites where bridges have been retrofitted or rebuilt to higher standards are expected to survive the earthquake shaking. So we can use this information to come up with a variety of different products. On the left is what we call a tsunami wave arrival time map. The example here is actually from down by Reedsport on the south central Oregon coast. We can explicitly define evacuation routes. We can define evacuation communities. So rather than having everyone go to one assembly area, in fact, your first objective is to go to your nearest exit point. And so the first objective is to leave the inundation zone, go to your nearest exit point. That may be defined by a blue line on a road, or a local sign that says that you're outside of that inundation zone. And then once things have settled down, then eventually evacuate to your nearest assembly area or shelter, wherever that may be, that's defined locally by groups like Linda's groups with the Nehalem Volunteer Group. And then obviously, lastly, the other product that we generate are these pedestrian travel speeds, which tell you the minimum evacuation speed that you must travel in order to reach safety. So I'm not going to say too much about this. This is an example on the left here for Manzanita. This is based on the XXL scenario, which is the maximum considered scenario. And what you see is that in most areas of Manzanita, the required speeds to reach each of those little green dots in the green area outside of the gray is classified as about a slow walk to walk. This means, if you think of it in this way, that a walk speed equates to the time it would take for you to travel across a crosswalk. That is a crosswalk that may be controlled by lights. And so that time is equivalent to about a walk. And so that's the speed, the minimum speed required to actually get out of that inundation zone and get to safety. And so in the case of Manzanita, safety is actually pretty close by. And so the chances of getting to safety are actually much, much higher relative to some other communities. But if we factor in complications like routes that may be impacted by liquefaction, for example, this is where the ground shakes violently, bubbles appear, and the roads will actually buckle and fail. You'll see sand boils and things like that appear on the surface. You'll see ponding of water. Those processes may actually serve to slow one's travel across that landscape down significantly. And so that can actually impact on your time required to get out of the inundation zone. So I'm not going to say too much about the Beat the Wave maps. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to go to the Oregon Tsunami Clearinghouse website. Just do a search, Oregon Tsunami Clearinghouse. You can find a lot more information about all our evacuation maps, including the Beat the Wave maps. And of course, the study areas here are defined on the right there. And then specifically, if you're interested in the results of our modeling work for Nehalem Bay, it's highlighted there as one of the communities where this information has been generated. And then lastly, I want to touch on a new product that's not yet out and that Laura's been working on. This is actually stems from a collaboration with folks at the University of Oregon to come up with a new, what we call Beat the Wave map public product that defines the tsunami evacuation routes. And so this example here is actually for downtown Florence, defining the speeds out of the inundation zone. And this is only generated for the XXL scenario that we all are familiar with, that are a part of our evacuation planning. And so this type of new product will be coming very soon. And obviously we'll be generating similar types of products for the Nehalem Valley area, including Manzanita, Nehalem, Wheeler, Rockaway Beach, etc., throughout Tillamook County. So lastly, what I want to touch on is obviously some new work, and this is really one of the purposes of this meeting, is to introduce some new modeling work that's been done for all of Tillamook County. And so I want to highlight some of the reasons why we might actually go about doing this. And these possible reasons include things like improvements in the modeling physics. This is the actual the model program that does all the calculations of the tsunami as it travels across the continental shelf and into estuaries and up on the land. That could be a reason why we might decide to do new models. There could be a change in the earthquake sources. We might have new information that's been generated over the last 9 years since the last big modeling effort was done back in that 2010, 2013 timeframe. There could also be problems with the model grid and the underlying digital elevation model. This is the DEM on which all these physical calculations are fundamentally based on, is this grid. And this example is what you're looking at here, is obviously the northern Tillamook County coastline, showing the land in gray and the ocean to the left of that rectangle in blue. And of course, you can see the estuary and spits, and you can see the shoreline showing the coastline for northern Tillamook Bay. And what you're looking at here is an example where we discovered a problem with the original grid that was done back in 2011 that was not discovered until a couple of years ago, when we started to actually really try to integrate all our geospatial data into a more well-defined folder, so to speak, where we could actually access all this information in a much better way than we could, say, 10 years ago. And so as a result of that organization and discovery process, we learned that there was a problem with the underlying grid on which the original tsunami evacuation maps were based on. So that caused me a little bit of discomfort, and we petitioned the National Tsunami Program to get some funding to do new modeling for Tillamook County. And we started that process late last year, and we're able to complete the inundation modeling earlier this year. And so what I'm going to share with you is obviously some of the updated results. So what is the new modeling involved? So in terms of the modeling physics, we haven't changed anything there. We're still using one of the best, most sophisticated models out there called Schism, a model that was developed by Joseph Zhang. We're using the same earthquake sources, so nothing has changed on that front. The modeling work that I'm going to show you is going to primarily center on the XXL, which is the worst case local scenario. But we have actually modeled a smaller scenario, what we term the L1, and also what we call the maximum considered distance scenario, or AK max. So we actually have results for all three of these, but I'm only going to show you results for one of these today. We account for, we still use a conservative roughness factor, which is where we set roughness at 0. This is consistent with the original modeling. And we also model it at a static level associated with mean high water. So all these upper parameters are unchanged, and the only thing that is actually modified is the underlying digital elevation model, or the grid that you're looking at there, which has been updated to reflect the new information available to us. So this screen shows in the middle there the outcome of that process of cleaning up this grid. We worked with what's called the National Center for Environmental Information out of Boulder, Colorado, to update that grid. They did a phenomenal job. They're part of NOAA, and they were able to collate a whole suite of new bathy and topographic information. These are measurements of the seabed and ground derived from LiDAR. As you can see in that upper right image there, a plane flying over an ocean and Barrier Beach there, collecting information out into the ocean. And it also utilized updated surveys from the Army Corps of Engineers that's collected at the mouths of jetties, and surveys that were done in early 2010 to 2013 that was not able to be integrated into our model at the time based on side scan sonar. So this is a kind of a much higher resolution view of that improved grid. And what you can see now is it resolves features like offshore bars at very high detail. It provides very good information in the channels with respect to the bathymetry, the navigation channel, and obviously the estuary itself. And it better defines the locations and elevations of levees, and upriver channels are also better defined. So what I'm going to show you now is a series of screen grabs of the updated results. And the important things to be aware of here is that in all cases, the pale green that you see up here to the right of 101 there is showing the area of safety or outside of the inundation zone. Yellow defines those areas where there is no change. The green near the transfer station is an area that's actually now going to be removed from the inundation zone. And the blue areas define areas that are now flooded based on the new modeling results. So in the case of Manzanita here, what you see is that near City Hall, there's actually a nominal improvement where part of the original inundation zone is now going to be taken out of the evacuation or updated evacuation maps. I'm going to run down to northern part of Nehalem Bay State Park. And again, just a reminder, green is now removed. And so there's now no flooding in those green areas. And we see near Carney Hill, which previously was outside of the inundation zone. Just to the right of that, we see a new area that's now taken out of, would be taken out of the evacuation map and could be used for evacuation purposes as well. This is a close-up view of Bayside Gardens in downtown Nehalem. And in the case of Bayside Gardens, because of the improvements to the bathymetry in the estuary, we're actually now seeing more inundation taking place along the periphery of the old inundation zone as defined by that blue area. We also see more inundation zones, more inundation in the northern portion, north of Highway 101, but most of this area is actually, there's no people living there, so it's really of less significance. And then down in downtown Nehalem, we see slightly greater inundation of downtown Nehalem community buildings as well. I should point out that the fire station near Bayside Gardens remains high and dry and is outside of the updated modeling results as well. This is an example looking now for the whole Nehalem Valley, upper portion of the Nehalem Valley. And so what you're looking at is we see now greater inundation occurring upriver of Aldervale by Norfolk Road there, which cuts across and joins onto Highway 53, the Nakanamka Highway. We also see slightly greater inundation by the North Fork and the Halem River to the west there. In Wheeler, the results are pretty boring, which is great, although it probably would have been nicer to have seen more areas removed. But in the case of Wheeler, we see just a very slight increase in inundation in a few discrete areas adjacent to Highway 101 there. But for the most part, it really doesn't change things dramatically. And lastly, I want to touch on downtown Tillamook, where we do actually see some very substantive changes where areas that were previously modeled as inundated and flooded by the tsunami in that sort of brighter green is now taken out, and specifically in the vicinity of the hospital itself. And you'll see in the upper left-hand side of the image there, a close-up view of the hospital showing that the inundation now only just skirts along the northwestern edge of the hospital facility. And for the most part, the hospital is now removed from that inundation zone. So what does this all mean, and what are the next steps? And so obviously in terms of approach, and we've had conversations with both Gordon, Althea, and Linda about the process for doing this. And what we've settled on is that, initial updates can be implemented very easily on the online viewer, as well as in the Tsunami app, and you can see links to both of those in the screen here. So that's the easiest approach that we can take for updating these maps, and they could be implemented fairly quickly at any point in time. We're obviously going to need to do continued education and outreach to inform people of these changes, and then we'll have to start to roll out updates to the PDF and paper versions of the evacuation brochures. That's a process that will probably take the remainder of this year and maybe into early next year to complete. And then obviously update existing "You Are Here" signage immediately up and down the Tillamook County coastline. So this is the process that we've settled on in terms of how one might go about updating these maps. So what I'm going to turn to now very quickly in the last few minutes that I have available to me is to talk a little bit about some additional new work that's going to be coming out later this year, probably in the next 1 to 2 months, relating to assessments of building damage, casualty, and debris modeling that we've been working on for all of Clatsop and Tillamook County. Clatsop will be rolling out probably early next month, followed by Tillamook not too long after. And so the example here gives you information about the number of residents for the medium, large, and XXL tsunami inundation zones for each of the communities in Tillamook County, expressed as a percentage in the middle plot there relative to the total number of residents in the county. And then to the right is estimates of the number of what we term temporary or visitor population that could be staying in VRBOs, hotels, motels, campgrounds for each of these communities. And the numbers that you see there in the right panel in the blue there indicate obviously the potential for very large numbers of people being located in each of these communities. And what you need to be aware of is that those estimates assume 100% occupancy in all those facilities. And in reality, that's not what we can expect to see. And so one can then start to scale back from these numbers by assuming, say, 10% or 25% or 50% occupancy levels for different communities. But the point is that this information is a starting point as we begin to plan for impacts within these communities. So this next screen there's a lot of information here, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but suffice to say is that now we can sort of drill down to each of the communities, Manzanita, Wheeler, Nehalem, etc., and really start to get at specific information about population demographics, those that may be over 65 versus under 65. So in the case here for Manzanita, we can see in the bottom left there, roughly 60% of the population is under 65, about 40% is over 65. And so this has implications for the speed at which people may be able to travel across the landscape to evacuate and reach high ground. We see in Manzanita that actually the numbers of people in the XXL tsunami inundation zone is about 56% of the total population in Manzanita. I'm not going to talk about the two middle panels, but on the right, you'll see the numbers of buildings that would be expected to be destroyed associated with this XXL tsunami. And that's about over 1,000 buildings. The total replacement cost of all these buildings is about 223 million. The earthquake damage alone is around about 40 million. But the tsunami damage is close to that total value of 233 million. So there's a lot of numbers here. And the reason why the numbers are so high for the tsunami is that, as you saw in my very, very first slide, the destruction from these events completely overshadows the destruction caused by just the earthquake shaking itself. And that's really going to be the dominant impact in many of these communities, where virtually every building in those inundation zones, unless they're reinforced with more stringent building codes, are probably going to fail and be destroyed. And obviously the last part that we worry a lot about is the degree of fatalities in terms of numbers, and obviously the numbers of displaced people that would be impacted in terms of post-disaster recovery. So we'll be rolling out products like this for both the medium, large, and XXL scenarios. And we'll be able to, we'll be sharing that with folks in Tillamook County. And we hope that this information will obviously be able to be used to encourage and facilitate that process of post-disaster planning that's really critical for every community to begin to implement, as both Gordon and Althea have discussed previously as well. So this last slide, it's a reminder of what we are all here about and what we need to be doing, which is getting prepared. And part of that process means knowing your evacuation routes. And in particular, it's important to walk them. It's not just a matter of downloading the map and looking at the map. You need to be able to walk these routes and time yourself. How long is it going to take you to get out of the inundation zone? And then obviously, as new maps are updated and rolled out, we encourage you to look at these maps, download them, and replace them in your existing go bags with the newer maps. And then, of course, obviously, a lot more information can be found at OregonTsunami.org. And again, we encourage you to download the Tsunami smartphone application, as well as look at the online maps as well. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we have some really thoughtful questions here. I'm going to pretty much read them as they were presented. The first one is, the Japanese people in 2011 planned for a tsunami of a certain height. The actual flooding by the tsunami overran the tsunami walls and was many meters higher, with approximately 18,000 dead. Can we be confident in the models today that you shared today? So if you could answer that, that'd be great.
Sure. So that's an excellent question. And I know this is one that's come up a number of times in the past. So the issue that we saw in Japan was that the geologic community or a geologic community had actually identified this Tohoku Trench area as a region that was susceptible to generating large tsunami events. And unfortunately, that knowledge was not utilized effectively by the engineers at the time, who and other geologists who actually did not agree that there was a great potential for these big type tsunami events occurring in the Tohoku area. In the case of Cascadia, we have obviously drawn together a wealth of expertise that were instrumental in developing the tsunami inundation scenarios that we eventually modeled, on which the evacuation maps are based. We incorporate a lot of conservatism in that modeling, such as the absence of friction, which means that the tsunami is able to inundate and run up the land much more significantly than were we to truly account for the effects of buildings or vegetation that would probably slow the tsunami propagation down quite significantly. And importantly, we have a much longer history and geologic history of the Cascadia zone relative to Japan. When we were developing the scenarios, we built a lot of conservatism into the modeling that was eventually implemented. So can I categorically say we've covered everything? The short answer is we believe with probably a 99.99% certainty that we've got it covered. There's always that remote chance. I mean, obviously, the most catastrophic potential scenario is a meteorite hitting the Pacific Ocean that where all bets are off, and we can expect to see something much greater. But in terms of Cascadia, we're as confident as we can be at this stage. Now, that's not to say that there may not be new science out there. And one of the things that we're doing to try and address that is that there are actually a series of workshops that are ongoing that will be starting later this year and going into next year that are going to be focused solely on Cascadia. Part of that is being spearheaded by the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, of which I'm a member and Althea is a member, where we're having a series of workshops in April next year to talk about Cascadia sources and updating those. But there's also a separate effort that's being spearheaded by the US Geological Survey, bringing in scientific experts from both North America, but also international, to again look at this issue of whether we've truly covered everything. And obviously, as we learn from those results, we will then hope to implement changes in the future. But at this stage, we're pretty confident we have the worst situation covered.
Thank you. So here's a question about the Pacific and Juan de Fuca plates. The question is, how do they interact? Is the Pacific plate pressing onto or under the Juan de Fuca? And is there a historical record that supports that?
So we know from geophysical surveys and sonar, deep ocean sonar surveys, we can map the both what you see on the surface and obviously what's below the surface from these variety of different techniques. What we know is that the Juan de Fuca plate is bounded on its western edge by a spreading ridge, which is an area of very active area in which new ocean crust is developing as magma comes up from below the earth and rises along that area and forms this region. It's like a fissure in the ocean, basically, in the ocean's crust, where new land is essentially generating. And then we know that obviously the Juan de Fuca itself then dives down below the North American plate, right along the edge of the continental shelf there. And that's the region that's diving down below where new rock is subsequently being melted and formed. And that's how we actually see our volcanic change, obviously, along the Cascades and so on. So we know this from obviously a lot of information, both geophysical as well as sonar type surveys of the seabed, etc.
Thank you. So several people would like to talk about liquefaction. And I think this question covers most everything that came from multiple people. I understand liquefaction is typically triggered by ground shaking in areas of water-saturated, poorly consolidated fill that has significant surface loads like large buildings and such. For instance, the Marina District in San Francisco during the 1989 earthquake. Can we expect much liquefaction in Manzanita? Is there evidence of subduction zone earthquake triggered liquefaction in the fossil records? And will my house sink into the hole?
So a lot of different elements there. The short answer is that I would encourage you all to take a look at what happened in New Zealand on November 14th in 2016, where we had a 7.8 earthquake that impacted Christchurch and caused very extensive damage to the city. And Althea actually showed a little bit of a video of the earthquake shaking and the collapse of buildings. And downtown Christchurch is an area that's been built on alluvial material, and is highly unconsolidated and has a very high water table. Now that characteristic is actually not too dissimilar from the situation in parts of Manzanita, particularly at low elevations where buildings may have been built on unconsolidated sands, and again, areas that are subject to high water tables. So the short answer is yes, we can expect to see similar types of effects happening in Manzanita, and obviously in all areas along the Oregon coast where we had that combination of unconsolidated material and high water tables. Now, obviously, if your house is built at high elevations and is built on basalt or something like that, then liquefaction is not going to be an issue. But if it is built on sand and is typically at lower elevation, that is a possibility. Communities like Nehalem and Wheeler also need to be mindful of the impacts of what we call lateral spreading, where the ground shaking causes areas adjacent to estuaries and river channels to shake and slump outwards into the river and estuary. And so you could see ground movement in those areas where it'll actually slide into the river and estuary. So both of those types of processes are going to be characteristic of areas around Manzanita. And yes, there's a lot of geologic evidence pointing to these types of processes.
Thank you. Does the new mapping extend further north of Manzanita? And if so, how far? And likewise, does it go south of Tillamook?
So the updated maps that will be eventually rolled out actually extend all the way up into Clatsop County. So we're going to be working with them as well in a similar sort of process to roll out updates there. The good news is that, and what I didn't touch on in today's presentation, two pieces of good news, I guess. First is that, essentially south of about Netarts Bay, the changes from the updated modeling doesn't really significantly alter the landscape relative to the old maps. So we did actually cover the whole of Tillamook County. We also covered all of Clatsop County. And so the updated maps that eventually will get rolled out for Clatsop show fairly nominal changes in the areas of Arch Cape up through Cannon Beach. And then we start to see some more significant changes well north of Gerhardt up towards the Camp Rylea and northern South Columbia River or northern Clatsop Spit area. So those are the areas where we'll see actually the largest changes up in Clatsop County.
Thank you. I think at this point I'm going to, I'll first ask you, Jonathan, do you want to bring Laura into the conversation at this point, or do you want her to join the panel?
No, I'm actually more than happy for Laura to join the conversation here. In fact, she could probably maybe speak to some other elements as well relating to what we know with respect to the geology. Okay.
So do you need a question, or do you to prompt, or do you have something?
Laura, do you want to maybe speak to, you're currently muted, but do you want to speak to maybe the question about the spreading ridge out on the Wanda Fuca?
Oh yeah, I think, everything you said, I think makes sense and explains the situation. Maybe one more thing is the question worded such that it was like, is one going under the other versus them pushing together or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
And just one other piece that maybe we'll tie together for that person who asked that question is this idea that, yeah, the Wanda Fuca plate, as John mentioned, it's being created out in the Pacific Ocean, and then it's like a conveyor belt. And when it hit North America, it has to go somewhere. And so one's going under the other. And that sort of is the fundamental source for these really great earthquakes. And that's why the biggest earthquakes on record in the history of the Earth are subduction zone earthquakes, is because you have two tectonic plates that are trying to push past each other. And there's just so much friction, and they don't just smoothly slide past. And so they get stuck and they just push against each other. And eventually, just like when you bend a stick, eventually you build up enough strain that it snaps. And so that's, they call it, you know, so right now we're in between these earthquakes. And so we're seeing that stress build, and eventually there will be enough strain built up on that boundary that it'll snap. And that's an earthquake. And then the cycle starts over again. And so they asked, that person asked about evidence that we know this is happening. And so John mentioned a couple of different geophysical things that where we can see that. Another thing is just the coast is uplifting very, very slowly. The coast is uplifting, you know, at a rate of and it depends where you are. It's variable with latitude all the way from Washington, you know, all along the Cascadia margin. The coastline is uplifting anywhere from 0 to a couple of millimeters a year. And we see that in GPS records. There are people that have used tide gauge stations and looked at where sea level is hitting over time to confirm that. And that makes sense with this idea that the North American plate is being, it's being squeezed by the Juan de Fuca plate. As the Juan de Fuca plate goes under, it's thickening the North American plate. It's kind of shortening it, and it's peeling up. So my knuckles are the coast, and it's pushing up the coast. And when we have this earthquake, the coast is going to drop back down. And that was incorporated into our modeling as well, that co-seismic subsidence that will lower the land by, you know, anywhere from a little bit to many, many feet, depending on how big the earthquake is and which location we're talking about. So that's just more evidence as to that being what's going on, our understanding of what's going on.
Great, thanks. So would either one of you like to answer the question in terms of what the mountainous structure between Manzanita and Neoconic communities is made of? Is it rock or sand?
Manzanita and Neoconi. Between Manzanita and Neoconi?
Yeah.
So most of that area is actually, there's a combination of basalt, which obviously makes up much of Neoconi Mountain itself. But within Neoconi, the community of Neoconi actually sits on a very large old landslide deposit. And so, you know, you've got many different components of processes that are operating in that specific area.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask Linda Kozlowski to join us, and Gordon, if you're still there and haven't been called away on an emergency, if you could join us. And to our viewers, I want to let you know that I'm about to launch a poll that you will be able to respond to, and about halfway through this last 20 minutes, I will release the results of the poll. So if you please participate in that, I appreciate it. And Althea, I apologize, I lost track of your box there, that you were going to come back onto the screen as well. So, so now we're going to do a panel questioning, which I'm going to do my level best to aim the question to the person that I think could start the answer, and then I'll let each of you toss it to whoever you think might add to your answer. And this is going to be fairly random, so it'll keep you on your toes. Random for me anyway. Okay, so this is going to go to Althea to start. Does OEM have a program in place for sharing mass care best practices with communities?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking that. So not specifically for communities. We have, so mass care is part of the emergency support function that is headed by the Department of Human Services along with other partners. And the role of mass care is sheltering and feeding after a disaster. So while we are learning a lot through the COVID, especially through this last wildfire episodes, I don't know that there is a specific in place process for sharing best practices. That's a really good question. And I can certainly push it up the chain of command there.
Okay. Gordon, would you have anything to add to that from a local perspective?
No, the last mass care, I don't want what we want to call it. I think the Nehalem Bay got a grant to do a mass care project, and that's the last one I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Jonathan, I'm sorry.
Let me read just a couple of things. So we did do a mass care plan, and we are in the process of implementing it, but it's pretty complex, and it really depends on the support of the cities in our region. The second thing is, and I'm not sure where to find it, but I know it's out there. There was a study done by the state for evaluating mass care, and a paper came out talking about the partnership with the state and the different communities. And I will locate that and put it on our website so that you would have access to it. It was done about 2 years ago, if I remember correctly.
I believe that one you're talking about was done by the Oregon State Seismic Policy Advisory Commission.
That's the one.
And it can be found on the OEM website.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Althea.
Okay, so Jonathan, I'm gonna start this with you. For those of us in Manzanita, is it really realistic for us to expect to survive a 9.0 Cascadia?
That's a loaded question. Look, you know, what we try to remind people is that obviously this is going to be a bad situation. As Althea has pointed out, this is going to be really, really bad. And it behooves all of us to do the best we can to prepare for the situation. And that obviously means there's a lot of personal preparation that's required in order to deal with the immediate effects of the event, and then obviously the minutes following the earthquake shaking in order to get to high ground and outside the inundation zone, and then obviously in the hours to days to weeks following that event. I mean, this is going to be a bad situation, but there are things we can do to prepare, and Althea and Gordon have touched on this many times today, and obviously that degree of preparation is going to have a direct effect on whether a person will survive an event or not. If you don't know your inundation, your evacuation route, and floundering, finding your go bag or things like that, where delays happen between the time at which the earthquake ends and the time you need to start moving, all that delay is going to increase the probability that you may not survive the event. So the important point that we try to stress is that this is a survivable event. You know, all bets are off with respect to buildings and the potential for them to fail, and obviously other ancillary types of effects. But with respect to the tsunami, providing you can get out of your building and get underway, you can survive this event. And if you're prepared, you can survive the days to weeks after that event. And I'll turn this over to Althea and Gordon, because I'm sure they'll want to speak to this as well.
Yeah, one thing to remember, during the 2011 Japanese event, there were 6 million people living in the impact zone and 15,000 people died. Most of those people died because of the tsunami, and they died because they didn't respond quickly enough to evacuation. And so we expect that, you know, if you are prepared, if you've practiced your routes, if you don't hesitate once you get through the first earthquake and you can get to high ground, you can certainly survive the impact of the tsunami. The next few weeks are probably going to be a struggle, and that again is where you can prepare for these types of events. So yes, these types of events are very survivable if you prepare.
And I would throw in one more thing. John's right that the details of getting out of a building and other impediments to evacuating are really individual, what we'll all experience. But, you know, a lot of our buildings are what's it called, light frame wood structures, like our homes, and those generally survive these kind of earthquakes. And that's another reason that this is a survivable event. Like we, you know, if assuming we can get out of our home, the homes will not collapse down and we will be able to evacuate and then begin walking out of the inundation zone. Most structures.
And I want to just reinforce what Althea just said before about what happened in Japan. I mean, you know, it is remarkable that 16 million people in that inundation zone, and around 15,000 were killed. I mean, that's a testament to, I mean, that's a lot of people killed, and obviously incredibly unfortunate and terrible situation. But it really is a testament to how well prepared Japan is. And people knew their evacuation routes, and the majority of people evacuated in time. And they practice drills on a frequent basis. And this is so critically important for our communities along the Pacific Northwest to be able to do this on a regular basis as well. But unfortunately, we don't do enough of things like that to prepare. And as a result, we're not as well prepared as Japan is, and we need to do more.
I have a couple of questions relative to that. John, you mentioned the word exit points, and that's a new terminology for us. And I think based on what you just said, really critical for us to understand. And then secondly, how long in the Nehalem Bay area between the earthquake itself and the potential arrival of the tsunami? So how much time do we really have?
So let me, you know, actually, I'm going to let Laura speak to this because this is something that Laura's been working on over the last 3 or 4 years with the evacuation modeling work, and she can speak to this.
Excellent.
John, why don't you answer the other part of that question, which I don't remember what it was, while I pull up an image.
Okay, so there were two questions, one relating to exit points. So I touched on this earlier with respect to the notion that the very first thing when you are evacuating a community, evacuating from your home, you need to go to your nearest point of high ground. Your nearest point of high ground may not necessarily be an assembly area. It is simply a point that is outside of that inundation zone. It's in that green zone that may be defined by, in some cases, a blue line across a road, or it may be defined by a leaving tsunami zone sign that you see on Highway 101, or it may be defined by an assembly area sign that's actually been located at that juncture. And it's important to stress that the first objective must be to go to that point in high ground. Get out of that inundation zone, ride out the first couple of hours, well, really, it's the first 12 hours in which the area will be impacted by tsunami waves. And then after that, then you can proceed safely, if you can, to your nearest assembly area or evacuation shelter or congregation point where mass care planning will begin to be implemented and rolled out. And then I think Laura's going to touch on the wave arrival. I mean, I can speak to that if need be, but.
Yeah, I just pulled up an image. So can I share my screen? Is that allowed, John? Not John Allen.
Yeah, Beeston. I bet he's working on it.
Well, I think I can at least try to, and then.
Yeah.
Okay. Share.
Ah, perfect.
Okay, so this is an old image, and I wasn't planning on sharing it today, but so this is a map of wave arrival for the whole Nehalem Bay area with, it's sort of hard to tell, but there is an inset for the Nehalem, the town of Nehalem. But so because it's such a large estuary, there's a long stretch of time between when the wave first arrives on the open coast and as it propagates upriver. So I'll zoom in, but just to give you some context here, these blue colors for the open coast are 20 minutes. So it reaches the beach. The first answer is it reaches the beaches in this area of Tillamook County about 20 minutes after the earthquake begins. So as we've discussed, the earthquake will last many minutes. And the way our tsunami modeling works, those minutes of earthquake shaking are included in these arrival times. And so if the tsunami arrives in 20 minutes, 3 to 5 of those minutes were earthquake shaking. So the beach is about 20 minutes, and then all of Manzanita is inundated within about 10 minutes of that. So between 20 to 30 minutes after the earthquake, and the spit, Nehalem spit, and the community of Manzanita has been inundated to its final reaches. Nehalem, you can see as it slows down, it spreads out, it loses some energy and some elevation as it goes upriver. And so it reaches Nehalem a little in the mid 30-minute range, and gets up to 101 there by about 38 minutes. And then you can actually, there's contours on this map. Isn't that nice? So 40 minutes as it's, approaching the North Fork, 46 minutes. And then it'll continue on for about another hour, I believe, or maybe another half hour before it reaches its final maximum extent a little bit further upriver.
Can you see Wheeler on that? Is there?
Yeah, I'll zoom in on that. I think I can zoom in on that. Wheeler is so it's such a narrow stretch of Wheeler that's actually inundated. Here's 101, and you can see, the zone that's inundated uphill from 101 is quite small, and that is it's about 35 minutes, 32 minutes, something like that. Does that answer that question, Linda?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, these contours are actually really nice. Here we can zoom in. So 28, yeah, so between 20 and 30 minutes, Manzanita is inundated. And then 5 minutes later, Nehalem is reached, and then it continues upriver from there.
Okay.
And I just want to draw your attention to a contrast is if you're on the south coast in Gold Beach, say for example, the wave arrives there in 10 minutes.
Wow.
And so it inundates downtown Gold Beach within about 15 to 17 minutes. So it's very fast on the southern Oregon coast, and it's because of its closer proximity to the subduction zone, as well as some other factors that come into play, but that's the main reason why.
Yeah, and John showed that in one of his slides, that the margin of the subduction zone is about 30 miles offshore in southern Oregon, and it's more like 50 to 55 miles in northern Oregon, and it makes a big difference. And also, like John said, there's deeper water closer to shore on the south coast, which allows the tsunami to retain more of its energy as it reaches the coastline versus slowing down on the continental shelf. So the south coast the tsunami arrives very quickly.
So it looks like the tsunamis start primarily in the south coast based on the model that John showed us. Is that correct? And if so, why?
No. So the rupture could actually take place. Effectively, could start anywhere along a subduction zone, and then it just simply unzips to the north and south, depending obviously on the degree of slip that takes place at that interface where it's locked, and whether there's enough energy allowed to be released at the time to cause it to propagate to the north and south. So really, the important point to appreciate is it could be anywhere along that subduction zone that initially will originate.
Okay, so I just released the poll results, so I'd like to draw your attention to that real quickly. It looks like that most of us have our go bag ready, and we know where our assembly area or neighborhood gathering site is, but we have work to do in terms of actually practicing getting to those places with our go bag. And we also need to work on writing those disaster plans. So thank you very much for participating in that poll, and we hope that you'll follow up and get those last two things in order. So I'm going to toss one last question, and then after the answers have come forth, Linda, I'll let you close the meeting. Okay? All right, so this is a fairly local question. Oops, I lost track of it here. Hold on. Oh, yes. Okay. Actually, it's very local. Are there any new plans, or are there any plans for a new tsunami siren system in Tillamook County or other notification system?
Gordon?
There are no plans that I'm aware of for anyone to reinstall the tsunami sirens. What you may or may not know is there was about 32 sirens originally, and they were owned by multiple agencies and partners in Tillamook County. The 911 center was merely the trigger to fire them off, but some of the fire districts owned some. There were some private entities that owned some. The county itself only owned 6 of them. So after the study came out showing where the distant tsunami threat area was, and you have to understand that the tsunami sirens were only good for that. The local tsunami, the ground shaking is your warning. You don't need the siren to tell you that it's time to go uphill after that. So it was just for the distant tsunami. And so based on where the sirens were, the fact that we now know where the threat area is, which was much smaller than we had originally thought it was, it just wasn't a good idea to keep the sirens because of their age, because of the fact that when it sounds, it doesn't really tell you anything other than there's something going on. So we had visitors that would frequently call me and say, is there a tornado? Is there flooding? Exactly what is that tsunami siren? I mean, exactly does that siren mean? Do I need to go somewhere, do something? So we have other means of notifying people now. And again, the 2011 earthquake showed us that we can go and knock on the doors of the people who are in the threat area for the distant tsunami, which is a much better plan than spending $30,000 to $50,000 per siren that doesn't really tell you very much. So we have other notification systems now. Both 911 has an alert notification system. I have one. They can ping your phones, your cell phones, your house phone. And again, we've got the fire trucks. I had, through a grant, was able to get some specialized speakers that the Civil Air Patrol has that actually work. They can fly down the coast and give a message, and it's quite nice because I can make the message on my phone and then text it to him or email it to him or whatever, and then they can stick it in the airplane and plug it into the speakers, and everybody gets the message. So that's what it is. And while I got the floor, I'm going to go ahead and throw in some thoughts from what other people had said. Mark Lebhart, commissioner here, once said, and he said it often actually, that his concern was as great for the disaster after the disaster as it was for the initial disaster itself. By that he meant that we would have injured people and people with health needs that can't be met for a period of time, and we're not going to be seeing people coming in for a period of time. So again, you could have another disaster after the disaster because of that. And like I think it was Jonathan that mentioned that, or somebody mentioned that we need to do the evacuation exercises more often. The coastal area is a pretty dynamic population. By that I mean we have a lot of people that come in and spend the summer and then leave, or some that don't stay. They come move here for a while, find it's not really to their liking, and then move out. So the education process needs to be continuous and ongoing just to meet the needs of the new people that you have in there. And then the evacuation maps, if we talk reality again, I get frequently asked questions about, well, your evacuation route takes me down here and then I got to go over there and I don't think I can make it in time. And my answer to them is always the same. When we draw the maps, we kind of have to use public land. We can't give you permission to go across somebody else's property. But what I can tell you is you need to go up. And if the difference means I go down and I don't make it, or I go up across somebody's property that maybe I shouldn't, I'm going to go up across that property that I shouldn't so that I survive. That's the most important thing right there.
And the other thing too is because our evacuation zones are quite conservative, you don't necessarily have to get to the extent of what is mapped on the evacuation brochures. Every step could be the last step you needed to reach safety in time. And that is why we modeled, I mean, we didn't get into this, but we modeled multiple size earthquake and tsunamis for that reason. And it gets a little more detailed, but it's not a guarantee that the next event will be as large as what is mapped. And so someone might feel defeated by looking at the map and seeing how far they have to walk, but as long as they're walking uphill, that could be enough.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Laura. Well, I want to take a minute to thank our 4 experts for joining us today. You have added great knowledge and information and something that's really important for us to understand. And we really appreciate the time you spent. Preparedness and education is critical to our community, and your contribution to that is very, very much appreciated. So thank you for spending your time, especially Laura, at the last minute, we asked you to join us, and that's just great. I just want to end by reminding everyone there are 3 things that we focus on here in the Halem Bay that's important for you to have in terms of preparedness. The first and most important is know where your evacuation or assembly site is, now your exit point, and make sure you practice that. Have a go bag ready at your door to be able to take with you immediately, and have a family plan that notifies or that will help you notify relatives outside of the area. We're going to put all of the contact information today on our website, so you'll have that on our website. And while you're on our website, we would really appreciate a donation that will help us continue to support our community and help this area thrive. So again, thank you all very much for joining us. We appreciate your spending the time on our very first webinar, and we hope to have several to follow. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So I think our webinar is now complete.
We're done broadcasting.
Phew.
Oh my God.
Mine still says it's live on YouTube, just saying.
Oh.